was the winter of 1978, and I was working as a park ranger up in Pinewood Forest, Minnesota. Back then, I was just a young guy in my late 20s, fresh out of the service and looking for some peace and quiet. Pinewood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and life moved slow, just the way I liked it. But that winter changed everything. It started with a storm, one of the worst blizzards I'd ever seen. The snow came down so thick, you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the cold, it bit right through your clothes, no matter how many layers you wore. I was holed up in the ranger station with my buddy Carl Mitchell. Carl was a local, born and raised in Pinewood, and he'd been a ranger for about 5 years. We'd been stuck in that station for 3 days, waiting for the storm to pass. The radio had been silent all week, nothing but static and the occasional crackle. But on the 4th night, it came to life. At first, I thought it was just more static, but then I heard a voice, faint and broken. "Hello? Is anyone there? We need help. We're stranded. No food. No firewood." Carl and I looked at each other. We knew the risks of going out in that kind of weather, but we also knew we couldn't just sit there. We packed what we could, blankets, rations, a first aid kit, and loaded it onto the snowmobile. The wind was so loud we had to shout just to hear each other. "You sure about this, Jack?" Carl asked, his breath visible in the cold air. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. "Let's go." The ride out to the hunters' camp was a nightmare. The snowmobile's headlights barely cut through the storm, and the wind kept pushing us off course. It felt like the forest was alive, like it didn't want us there. We followed the coordinates the hunters had given us, but the deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. Something about those woods. It was like they were watching us. When we finally reached the camp, it was a mess. The tent was torn to shreds and supplies were scattered everywhere. There were tracks in the snow, big ones like nothing I'd ever seen. And then there was the blood. It was everywhere, staining the snow a dark red. Carl and I called out for the hunters, but there was no answer, just silence. That's when we heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was like someone trying to mimic words, but they didn't get it quite right. "Help. Us," it said, but the voice was all wrong. Too high, too sharp. Carl grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and it had antlers. Like a deer, but twisted, wrong. It just stood there, watching us. Then it let out this ungodly scream, and we ran like hell. The snowmobile was our only hope, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Carl was yelling, "Go, go, go!" And finally, the engine roared to life. We took off, the creature's screams echoing behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station. My hands were still shaking as I fumbled with the keys to unlock the door. Carl was right behind me, his face pale and his breath coming in ragged gasps. Once we were inside, we barricaded the door with whatever we could find, a heavy table, a couple of chairs, even the wood stove. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew what the other was thinking. That thing out there, it wasn't natural, it wasn't human, and it was still out there. The rest of the night was a blur. We kept the rifles close, taking turns watching the windows. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. Every now and then I'd hear something, a scratching at the door, a thump on the roof, and my heart would stop. Carl tried to lighten the mood. cracking jokes about how we'd tell this story at the bar once it was all over. But his laughter sounded forced, and his eyes kept darting to the windows. We both knew this wasn't something you could laugh off. By morning, the storm had finally passed. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered forest. It should have felt like a relief, but it didn't. The silence was worse than the storm. Carl and I stepped outside, rifles in hand, and surveyed the area. The snowmobile tracks from the night before were still visible, leading back into the woods. But there were other tracks too, large, uneven prints that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. They circled the station, coming right up to the door before disappearing into the trees. We knew we had to go back out there. Those hunters were still missing, and if there was any chance they were alive, we had to find them. But the thought of going back into those woods, it made my stomach churn. Carl must have felt the same way because he didn't argue when I suggested we call for backup. We radioed the sheriff's office, but the response was grim. The storm had knocked out power lines and blocked roads all over the county. It would be days before anyone could reach us. We were on our own. Reluctantly, we geared up and headed back into the forest. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a struggle. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisted like claws. The only sound was the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional caw of a crow. But then, just as we reached the hunters' camp, we heard it again, that voice. "Help! Us!" It was coming from the trees. Carl raised his rifle, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. I did the same, and together we stepped into the shadows. The voice led us deeper into the woods, but no matter how far we went, we couldn't find its source. It was always just ahead of us, echoing through the trees like a cruel joke. The hunters' camp was behind us now, and the forest grew darker and denser with every step. The snow was thinner here, the ground uneven and covered in dead leaves. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. It felt like we were walking into the mouth of some great dark beast. We found the first body about 1/2 mile from the camp. It was one of the hunters, a man in his 40s, with a thick beard and a red flannel jacket. He was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide open and frozen in terror. His jacket was torn to shreds, and his chest, it looked like something had ripped it open. Carl cursed under his breath and turned away, but I couldn't look away. There were marks on the ground around him, deep gouges in the dirt like something had dragged him there, and the blood, there was so much blood. We didn't have time to process what we'd found. The voice came again, louder this time, and it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was several, overlapping and distorted like a chorus of the damned. "Help! Us! Help! Us!" It was coming from all directions now, and I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. Carl grabbed my arm and pointed to the ground. More tracks, the same large, uneven prints we'd seen at the station. They led further into the woods, toward a narrow ravine. We followed them, our rifles at the ready, but every step felt like a mistake. The ravine was steep and filled with shadows. At the bottom, we found the other hunters, or what was left of them. Their bodies were scattered across the ground, broken and mangled beyond recognition. One of them was missing his head, and another, it looked like something had been eating him. The smell was unbearable, a mix of blood and rot that made me gag. Carl stumbled back, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What the hell did this?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing: we weren't alone. As we stood there, frozen in horror, the voices stopped. The forest fell silent, and the air grew still. And then, from somewhere above us, came a low, guttural growl. I looked up, just in time to see it. the creature. It was perched on a ledge overlooking the ravine, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Its antlers were massive, twisted and jagged like broken branches, and its mouth, it was open, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. It let out a scream that echoed through the ravine, and then it leaped. Carl and I didn't wait to see where it landed. We ran. We ran blindly through the forest, our boots slipping on the snow and dead leaves. The creature's screams followed us, echoing through the trees like a predator, toying with its prey. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the crunch of snow, the snap of branches, the low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Carl was ahead of me, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed through the underbrush. We didn't have a plan, we just ran, driven by pure instinct and the desperate hope that we could outrun whatever that thing was. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around us like a maze. Every turn looked the same, every shadow hid a new threat. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I kept going. I had to. The alternative was unthinkable. Carl suddenly skidded to a stop, and I nearly collided with him. "What are you doing?" I hissed, but he didn't answer. He was staring at something up ahead, a narrow, rocky path that led down into a steep gully. "We can't go back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the only way." The gully was dark and narrow, the walls slick with ice and moss. We half slid, half fell our way down, our hands scraping against the rocks as we tried to keep our balance. The creature's screams grew louder, closer, and I could hear it scrambling down the slope behind us. My heart pounded in my chest, and every breath felt like a knife in my lungs. At the bottom of the gully was a small cave, its entrance partially hidden by a tangle of roots and vines. Carl didn't hesitate. He dove inside, and I followed, crawling on my hands and knees through the narrow opening. The cave was small and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. We pressed ourselves against the back wall, our rifles trained on the entrance. The creature's screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, and the sound of Carl's breathing beside me. We didn't speak, we didn't move. We just waited, our eyes fixed on the faint light filtering through the cave's entrance. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was impossible to tell. And then, just as I started to think we might be safe, we heard it. A low, guttural growl right outside the cave. The creature's shadow appeared at the entrance, blocking out the light. It was too big to fit inside, but that didn't stop it from trying. Its claws scraped against the rocks as it reached into the cave, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Carl fired first, the sound of the rifle deafening in the confined space. The creature let out a shriek and pulled back, but it didn't leave. It just stood there, watching us, its breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. I fired too, and then Carl fired again, but it didn't matter. The creature wasn't going anywhere, and neither were we. We were trapped. The creature's massive frame blocked the cave entrance, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness as it snarled and clawed at the rocks. Carl and I fired again and again, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. It was like trying to stop a force of nature. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely reload my rifle. Carl was in no better shape, his face pale and slick with sweat. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" he said, his voice barely audible over the creature's growls. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Then, out of nowhere, the creature let out a deafening roar and stumbled back. For a moment I thought we'd finally hurt it, but then I saw the flames. Someone had set the forest on fire. The dry underbrush and fallen leaves had caught quickly, and the flames were spreading fast, lighting up the gully in an eerie orange glow. The creature turned toward the fire, its antlers silhouetted against the flames, and let out a scream that made my blood run cold. It hesitated for a moment, then lunged into the burning forest, disappearing into the smoke. Carl and I didn't waste any time. We crawled out of the cave and scrambled up the gully, our lungs burning from the smoke and our eyes stinging from the heat. The fire was everywhere, consuming the trees and underbrush with terrifying speed. We ran blindly, our only thought to put as much distance between us and the flames as possible. The heat was unbearable, and the air was thick with ash, but we kept going. We had to. When we finally broke free of the forest, we collapsed on the frozen ground, gasping for air. The fire raged behind us, lighting up the night sky, but we were safe. Or at least we thought we were. As I lay there, staring up at the stars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of that creature. It was still out there, somewhere in the burning forest, waiting. Carl must have felt it too, because he turned to me and said, "We can't tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, but deep down I knew the truth. Some things are better left buried. The fire burned for 3 days before the rain finally put it out. By then the forest was gone, reduced to ash and charred tree trunks. The hunters' bodies were never found, and the official story was that they'd been caught in the fire. Carl and I never talked about what happened that night, not even to each other, but I still hear it sometimes, in the dead of winter when the wind howls through the trees. That voice calling out from the darkness. "Help! Us!" And I know, no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the Wendigo of Pinewood Forest. Drop a comment. We want to hear your thoughts. Smash that like button if you enjoy our content. Share this with your friends and help us grow. Subscribe now for more.